In this case, we have a network which has an input on the left-hand side. Usually you have the input on the bottom side or on the left. They are pink in my slides, so if you take notes, make them pink. No, just kidding. And then we have what? How many activations? How many hidden layers do you count there? 4 hidden layers. So overall, how many layers does the network have here? 6, right? Because we have 4 hidden plus 1 input plus 1 output layer. So in this case, I have 2 neurons per layer, right? So what does it mean? What are the dimensions of the matrices we are using here? 2 by 2. So what does a 2 by 2 matrix does? Come on, you know the answer to this question. Rotation, yeah, then scaling, then sharing, and reflection. Fantastic, right? So we constrain our network to perform all the operations on the plane. We have seen the first time, if I allow the hidden layer to be 100 neurons long, we can easily.
Thanks, and I offer mine.
Fantastic. What is it? We are watching movies now, I see. See, fantastic. What is it? Mandalorian. It's so cool, huh? Okay. Okay. How nice is this lesson is even recorded. Okay, I have no idea. Okay, give me a sec. Okay, so we go here. Done. This one. All right. So we started from this network here, right? Which we had this intermediate layer, and we forced them to be two-dimensional, right? Such that all the transformations are enforced to be on a plane. So this is what the network does to our plane. It folds it on specific regions, right? And those folding are very, very abrupt. This is because all the transformations are performed in the 2D layer, right? So this training took me really, really a lot of effort because the optimization is actually quite hard. Whenever I had the 100 neuron hidden layer, that was very, very easy to train. This one really, really took a lot of effort, and you had to tell me why, okay? If you don't know the answer right now, better you know the answer for the midterm. So you can take note of what are the questions in the midterm. Right, so this is the final output of the network, which is also that 2D layer 2D embedding, so I have no nonlinearity on my last layer. And these are the final classification regions. So let's see what each layer does. This is the first layer, affine transformation. So it looks like it's a 3D rotation, but it's not, right? It's just a 2D rotation, reflection, scaling, and shearing. And then what is this part? What's happened right now? Do you see? We had like the redo part, which is killing all the negative sides of the network, right? All the negative sides of this space, right? This is the second affine transformation. And then here you apply again the redo. You can see all the negative subspaces have been erased and they've been set to 0. Then we keep going with the third affine transformation. Is zoom in a lot. And then again, you're going to have now the redo layer, which is going to be killing one of those, all the 3 quadrants, right? Only 1 quadrant survives every time. And then we go with the fourth affine transformation, where it's elongating a lot, because again, given that we confine all the transformation to be living in the space, it really needs to stretch and use all the power it can, right? Again, this is the second last. Then we had the last affine transformation, which is the final one. And then we reach, finally, linearly separable regions here. Finally, we're going to see how each affine transformation can be split in its components. So we have rotation. We have now squashing, like zooming. Then we have rotation, reflection, because the determinant is -1. And then we have the final bias. Again, you have the positive part of the redo, rectified linear unit. Again, rotation, flipping, because again, we had a negative -1 determinant, zoom in, rotation, one more reflection, and then the final bias. This was the second affine transformation. Then we have here the positive part. Again, we are third layer, so rotation, reflection, zooming, and then we have this is SVD decomposition, right? You should be aware of that, right? You should know. And then final is the translation, and again the third ReLU. Then we have the fourth layer, so rotation, reflection because the determinant was negative, zooming, again the other rotation, once more reflection, and the bias. Finally ReLU, and then we have the last, the fifth layer. So rotation, zooming, we didn't have reflection because the determinant was +1. Again, reflection in this case because the determinant was negative, and then finally the final bias, right? And so this was pretty much how this network, which was just made of a sequence of layers of neurons that are only 2 neurons per layer, is been performing the classification task. And all those transformations have been constrained to be living on the plane, okay? So this was really, really hard to train. Can you figure out why it was really, really hard to train? What does it happen if my bias of one of the 5 layers put my points in away from the top right quadrant?
The observation would become 0.
Exactly. So if you have one of the 4 biases putting my initial point away from the top right quadrant, then the ReLUs are going to be completely killing everything, and everything gets collapsed into 0. Okay? And so there you can't do any more anything, right? So this network here was really hard, again, to train. If you just make it a little bit fatter, then instead of constraining it to be 2 neurons for each of the hidden layer, then it's much easier to train. Or you can do a combination of the 2, right? So instead of having just a fat network, you can have a network that is less fat, but then you have a few hidden layers, okay? So that was pretty much, yeah, question?
Network.
So the fatness is how many neurons you have per hidden layer, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So the question is that how do we determine the structure or the configuration of our network, right? How do we design network? And the answer is going to be, that's what Jan is going to be teaching across the semester, right? So keep it like, keep your attention high because, that's what we're going to be teaching here. That's a good question, right? There is no like mathematical rule. Like there is a lot of experimental, empirical evidence, and a lot of people trying different configurations. We found something that actually works pretty well now. Again, we're going to be covering these architectures in the following lessons. Other questions? Don't be shy. No? Okay. So I guess then we can switch to the second part of the class.
Okay, so we're going to talk about convolutional nets today. And let's dive right in. So I'll start with something that's relevant to convolutional nets, but not just, which is the idea of transforming the parameters of a neural net. So here we have a diagram that we've seen before, except with a small twist. The diagram we're seeing here is that we have a neural net, G, of x and w being the parameters, x being the input, that makes a prediction about an output, and that goes into a cost function. We've seen this before. But the twist here is that the weight vector, instead of being a parameter that's being optimized, is actually itself the output of some other function, possibly parameterized. In this case, this function is not a parameterized function, or it's a parameterized function, but the only input is another parameter u. Okay, so essentially, what we've done here is made the weights of that neural net a function of some more elementary parameters u through a function. And you realize really quickly that backprop just works there, right? If you backpropagate gradients through the g function to get the gradient of whatever objective function you're minimizing with respect to the weight parameters, you can keep backpropagating through the h function here to get the gradients with respect to u. So in the end, you're sort of propagating things like this. So when you're updating u, you're multiplying the Jacobian of the objective function with respect to the parameters, and then by the Jacobian of the h function with respect to its own parameters. Okay, so you get the product of 2 Jacobians here, which is just what you get from backpropagating. You don't have to do anything in PyTorch for this. This will happen automatically as you define the network. And that's kind of the update that occurs. Now, of course, W being a function of u through the function h, the change in W will be the change in u multiplied by the Jacobian of h transpose. And so this is the kind of thing you get here. The effective change in W that you get without updating W, you're actually updating U, is the update in U multiplied by the Jacobian of H. And we had a transpose here. We have the opposite there. This is a square matrix, which is NW by NW, which is the dimension of W squared. Okay, so this matrix here has as many rows as W has components. And then the number of columns is the number of components of U. And then this guy, of course, is the other way around. So it's NU by NW. So when you make the product, do the product of those two matrices, you get an NW by NW matrix. And then you multiply this by this NW vector, and you get an NW vector, which is what you need for updating the weights. Okay, so that's a kind of a general form of transforming the parameter space. And there's many ways you can use this, and a particular way of using it is when H is what's called what we talked about last week, which is a sort of Y connector. So imagine the only thing that H does is that it takes one component of U and it copies it multiple times, so that you have the same value, the same weight replicated across the G function. The G function will use the same value multiple times. So this would look like this. So let's imagine U is two-dimensional, U1, U2, and then W is four-dimensional, but W1 and W2 are equal to U1, and W3, W4 are equal to U2. So basically, you only have two free parameters, and when you're changing one component of U, you're changing two components of W at the same time in a very simple manner. And that's called weight sharing. Okay, when two weights are forced to be equal, they're actually equal to a more elementary parameter that controls both. That's weight sharing, and that's kind of the basis of a lot of ideas, convolutional nets among others. But that you can think of this as a very, very simple form of H of U. So again, you don't need to do anything for this in the sense that when you have weight sharing, if you do it explicitly with a module that does kind of a Y connection on the way back, when the gradients are backpropagated, the gradients are summed up. So the gradient of some cost function with respect to U1, for example, will be the sum of the gradients of that cost function with respect to W1 and W2. And similarly for the gradient with respect to U2 will be the sum of the gradients with respect to W3 and W4. Okay? That's just the effect of backpropagating through the two Y connectors. Okay, here's a slightly more general view of this parameter transformation here that some people have called hypernetworks. So a hypernetwork is a network where the weights of one network are computed as the output of another network. Okay, so you have a network H that looks at the input. It has its own parameters U, and it computes the weights of a second network. Okay, and so the advantage of doing this. There's various names for it. The idea is very old, goes back to the 80s. People are using what's called multiplicative interactions or three-way network or sigma pi units, and they're basically this idea, and this is maybe a slightly more general formulation of it, that you have sort of a dynamically, a function that's going to dynamically defined in G of X and W. Because W is really a complex function of the input and some other parameter. This is particularly interesting architecture when what you're doing to X is transforming it in some ways, right? So you can think of W as being the parameters of that transformation. So Y would be a transformed version of X, and the X, the function H basically computes that transformation. Okay, but we'll come back to that in a few weeks. Just wanted to mention this because it's basically a small modification of this, right? You just have one more wire that goes from X to H, and that's how you get those hypernetworks. Okay, so weight sharing, that's the idea that you can have one parameter controlling multiple effective parameters in another network. And one reason that's useful is if you want to detect a motif on an input, and you want to detect this motif regardless of where it appears. Okay, so let's say you have an input, let's say it's a sequence, but it could equally be an image. In this case, it's a sequence of vectors, let's say. And you have a network that takes a collection of 3 of those vectors, 3 successive vectors. It's this network G of X and W. And it's trained to detect a particular motif of those 3 vectors. Maybe this is, I don't know, the power consumption, electrical power consumption. And sometimes, you might want to be able to detect like a blip or a trend or something like that. Or maybe it's, financial instruments of some kind. Some sort of time series. Maybe it's a speech signal and you want to detect a particular sound that consists in 3 vectors that define the sort of audio content of that speech signal. And so you'd like to be able to detect, if it's a speech signal and there's a particular sound you need to detect for doing speech recognition, you might want to detect, the sound, the vowel P, right? The sound P, wherever it occurs in the sequence, you want some detector that fires when the sound P is pronounced. And so what you'd like to have is a detector that you can slide over, right? And regardless of where this motif occurs, detect it. So what you need to have is some network, some parameterized function that, you have multiple copies of that function that you can apply to various regions on the input, and they all share the same weight. But you'd like to train this entire system end to end. So for example, let's say, let's talk about a slightly more sophisticated thing here where you have, let's see, a keyword that's being pronounced. So the system listens to sound and wants to detect when a particular keyword, a wake-up word has been pronounced, right? So this is Alexa, right? And you say Alexa, and Alexa wakes up. It goes bong, right? So what you like to have is, some network that kind of takes a window over the sound and then sort of keeps, in the background, sort of detecting. But you'd like to be able to detect, wherever the sound occurs within the frame that is being looked at, was being listened to, I should say. So you could have a network like this where you have, replicated detectors, they all share the same weight, and then the output, which is, a score as to whether something has been detected or not, goes to a max function, okay, and that's the output. And the way you train a system like this, you will have a bunch of samples, audio examples where the keyword has been pronounced, and a bunch of audio samples where the keyword was not pronounced. And then you train a 2-class classifier, turn on when Alexa is somewhere in this frame, turn off when it's not. But nobody tells you where the word Alexa occurs within the window that you train the system on. Okay, because it's really expensive for labelers to look at the audio signal and tell you exactly, well, this is the word Alexa is being pronounced. The only thing they know is that, within this segment of a few seconds, the word has been pronounced somewhere. Okay, so you'd like to apply a network like this that has those replicated detectors. You don't know exactly where it is, but you run through this max, and you want to train the system to, you want to backpropagate gradient to it so that it learns to detect, Alexa or whatever wake-up word occurs. And so there, what happens is you have those multiple copies, 5 copies in this example of this network, and they all share the same weight. And you can see this as just one weight vector sending its value to 5 different instances of the same network. And so when you backpropagate through the 5 copies of the network, you get 5 gradients, and those gradients get added up for the parameter. Now, there's a slightly strange way this is implemented in PyTorch and other deep learning framework, which is that this accumulation of gradient in a single parameter is done implicitly. And it's one reason why, before you do a backprop in PyTorch, you have to zero out the gradient, because there's sort of implicit accumulation of gradients when you do backpropagation. Okay, so here's another situation where that would be useful, and this is for really the real motivation behind convolutional nets in the first place, which is the problem of training a system to recognize a shape independently of the position of whether the shape occurs and whether there are distortions of that shape in the input. So here, this is a very simple type of convolutional net that has been built by hand. It's not been trained. Okay, it's been designed by hand. And it's designed explicitly to distinguish C's from D's. Okay, so you can draw a C on the input image, which is very low resolution. And what distinguishes C's from D's is that C's have endpoints, right? There's the stroke kind of ends. And you can imagine designing a detector for that, whereas D's have corners. So if you have an endpoint detector, something that detects the end of a segment, and a corner detector, wherever you have corners that are detected, it's a C, it's a D, and wherever you have segments that end, it's a C. So here's an example of a C. You take the first detector, so the little black and white motif here at the top is an endpoint detector. Okay, it detects the end of a segment, and the way this is represented here is that the black pixels here. So think of this as some sort of template. Okay, you're going to take this template and you're going to swipe it over the input image, and you're going to compare that template to the little image that is placed underneath. Okay, and if those two match, the way you're going to determine whether they match is that you're going to do a dot product. So you're going to think of those black and white pixels as value of +1 or -1, say +1 for black, -1 for white. And you're going to think of those pixels also as being +1 for black and -1 for white. And when you compute the dot product of a little window with that template, if they are similar, you're going to get a large positive value. If they're dissimilar, you're going to get a 0 or negative value, or a smaller value. Okay? So you take that little detector here, and you compute the dot product with the first window, second window, third window, etc. You shift by 1 pixel every time for every location, and you record the result. And what you get is this, right? So this is here the grayscale is an indication of the matching, which is actually the dot product between the vector formed by those values and the patch at the corresponding location on the input. So this image here is roughly the same size as that image, minus border effects. And which is, you see there is whenever the output is dark, there is a match. So you see a match here, because this endpoint detector here matches the endpoint. You see sort of a match here at the bottom. And the other kind of values are not as dark, okay? Not as strong, if you want. Now, if you threshold those values, you set the output to +1 if it's above the threshold, 0 if it's below the threshold, you get those maps. You have to adapt the threshold appropriately. But what you get is that, this little guy here detected a match at the two endpoints of the C. Okay, so now if you take this map, you sum it up, just add all the values, you get a positive number, pass that through the threshold, and that's your C detector. It's not a very good C detector. It's not a very good detector of anything, but for those particular examples of C's and maybe those D's, it will work. It'll be enough. Now for the D, it's similar. Those other detectors here are meant to detect the corners of the D, right? So this guy here, this detector, as you swipe it over the input, will detect the upper left corner, and that guy will detect the lower right corner. Once you threshold, you will get those two maps where the corners are detected, and then you can sum those up, and the D detector will turn on. Now, what you see here is an example of why this is good, because that detection now is shift invariant. So if I take the same input D here, and I shift it by a couple pixels, and I run this detector again, it will detect the motif wherever they appear. The output will be shifted, okay? So this is called equivariance to shift. So the output of that network is equivariant to shift, which means that if I shift the input, the output gets shifted, but otherwise unchanged. Okay, that's equivariance. Invariance would be if I shifted the input, the output would be completely unchanged. But here it is modified. It just modified the same way as the input. And so if I just sum up the activities in the feature maps here, it doesn't matter where they occur. My D detector will still activate, right? If I just compute the sum. So this is sort of a handcrafted pattern recognizer that uses local feature detectors and then kind of sums up their activity, and what you get is an invariant detection. Okay, this is a fairly classical way actually of building certain types of pattern recognition systems, going back many years. But the trick here, what's important, of course, what's interesting would be to learn those templates. Can we view this as just a neural net and we backpropagate to it and we learn those templates as weights of a neural net? After all, we're using them to do dot product, which are weighted sums. So, basically, this layer here to go from the input to those so-called feature maps that are weighted sums is a linear operation. Okay, and we know how to backpropagate to that. We'd have to use, a kind of a soft threshold, a value, or something like this here, because otherwise we can do backprop. Okay, so this operation here of taking the dot product of a bunch of coefficients with an input window and then swiping it over, that's a convolution. Okay, so that's the definition of a convolution. It's actually the one up there. So this is in the one-dimensional case where imagine you have an input xj, so x indexed by the j index. You take a window of x at a particular location I, okay, and then you do a weighted sum of a little window of the x values, and you multiply those by the weights wj's. Okay, and the sum presumably runs over a kind of a small window. So j here would go from 1 to, 5, something like that, which is the case in the little example I showed earlier. Okay, and that gives you 1 yi. Okay, so take the first window of 5 values of x, compute a weighted sum with the weights, that gives you y1. Then shift that window by 1, compute the weighted sum of the dot product of that window by the w's, that gives you y2, shift again, etc. Okay? Now, in fact, in practice, what people implement in things like PyTorch, there is a confusion between two things that mathematicians think are very different, but in fact, they're pretty much the same. It's convolution and cross-correlation. So in convolution, the convention is that the index goes backwards in the window when it goes forwards in the weights. In cross-correlation, they both go forward. In the end, it's just a convention. It depends on how you organize the data in your weights. You can interpret this as a convolution if you read the weights backwards. So really doesn't make any difference. But for certain mathematical properties of convolution, if you want everything to be consistent, you have to have the j in the w having an opposite sign to the j in the x. So the two-dimensional version of this, if you have an image x that has two indices, in this case I and j, you do a weighted sum over two indices, k and l, and so you have a two-dimensional window indexed by k and l, and you compute the dot product of that window over x with the weights, and that gives you one value in yij, which is the output. So the vector w, or the matrix w in the 2D version, there is obvious extensions of this to 3D and 4D, etc. It's called a kernel. It's called a convolution kernel. Okay. Is that clear? I'm sure this is known to many of you, but so what we're going to do with this is that we're going to organize, build a network as a succession of convolutions where in a regular neural net you have alternation of linear operators and pointwise nonlinearity. In convolutional nets, we're going to have an alternation of linear operators that will happen to be convolutions or multiple convolutions, then also pointwise nonlinearity, and there's going to be a third type of operation called pooling, which is actually optional. Before I go further, I should mention that there are twists you can make to this convolution. So one twist is what's called a stride. So a stride in a convolution consists in moving the window from one position to another. Instead of moving it by just one value, you move it by 2 or 3 or 4. Okay, that's called a stride of a convolution. And so if you have an input of a certain length, and so let's say you have an input which is kind of a one-dimensional and of size 100, and you have a convolution kernel of size 5, okay, and you convolve this kernel with the input, and you make sure that the window stays within the input of size 100, the output you get has 96 outputs, okay? It's got the number of inputs minus the size of the kernel, which is 5, minus 1. Okay, so that makes it 4. So you get 100 minus 4, that's 96. That's the number of, windows of size 5 that fit within this big input of size 100. Now, if I use a stride, so what I do now is I take my window of 5, where I apply the kernel, and I shift it not by 1 pixel, but by 2 pixels. Or 2 values, let's say. They're not necessarily pixels. Okay, the number of outputs I'm going to get is going to be, divided by 2 roughly. Okay, instead of 96, I'm going to have, a little less than 50, 48 or something like that. The number is not exact. You can figure out in your head. Very often when people run convolutions in convolutional nets, they actually pad the convolution. So they sometimes like to have the output being the same size as the input. And so they actually displace the input window past the end of the vector, assuming that it's padded with zeros, usually on both sides.
Does it have any effect on performance, or is it just to make it more convenient?
Does it have any effect on performance, or is it just for convenience? If it has an effect on performance, it's bad, okay? But it is convenient. That's pretty much the answer. The assumption that's bad is assuming that when you don't have data, it's equal to 0. So when your nonlinearities are value, it's not necessarily completely unreasonable. But it sometimes creates like funny border effects, boundary effects. Okay, everything clear so far? Right. Okay, so what we're going to build is a neural net composed of those convolutions that are going to be used as feature detectors, local feature detectors, followed by nonlinearities, and then we're going to stack multiple layers of those. Okay? And the reason for stacking multiple layers is because we want to build hierarchical representations of the visual world, of the data. It's not, convolutional nets are not necessarily applied to images. They can be applied to speech and other signals. They basically can be applied to any signal that comes to you in the form of an array. And I'll come back to the properties that this array has to verify. So what you want is, why do you want to build hierarchical representations? Because the world is compositional. And I alluded to this, I think, in the first lecture, if I remember correctly. It's the fact that, pixels assemble to form simple motifs like oriented edges. Oriented edges kind of assemble to form local features like corners and T-junctions and things like that, gratings, And then those assemble to form motifs that are slightly more abstract. Those assemble to form parts of objects, and those assemble to form objects. So there is this sort of natural compositional hierarchy in the natural world. And this natural compositional hierarchy in the natural world is not just because of perception, visual perception. It's true at the physical level, right? You start at the lowest level of description. You have elementary particles, and they form, they clump to form less elementary particle, and they clump to form atoms, and they clump to form molecules, and molecules clump to form materials, and materials, parts of objects, and parts of objects into objects, and things like that, right? Or macromolecules, or polymers, blah, blah, blah. And then you have this natural compositional hierarchy. The world is built this way. And it may be why the world is understandable, right? So there's this famous quote from Einstein that says, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that the world is comprehensible. And it seems like a conspiracy that we live in a world that we are able to comprehend. But we can't comprehend it because the world is compositional, and it happens to be easy to build brains in a compositional world that actually can interpret compositional world. It still seems like a conspiracy to me. So there's a famous quote from well, not that famous, but somewhat famous, from a statistician at Brown called Stu Gehman. And he says, that sounds like a conspiracy, like magic, but, if the world were not compositional, we would need some even more magic to be able to understand it. And the way he says this is, the world is compositional, or there is a God. You would need to appeal to superior powers if the world was not compositional to explain how we can understand it. Okay, so this idea of hierarchy and local feature detection comes from biology. So the whole idea of convolutional nets comes from biology. It's been sort of inspired by biology. And what you see here on the right is a diagram by Simon Thorpe, who is a psychophysicist, and did some relatively famous experiments where he showed that the way we recognize everyday objects seems to be extremely fast. So if you you flash the image of an everyday object to a person, and you flash one of them every 100 milliseconds or so, you realize that the time it takes for the person to identify in a long sequence whether there was a particular object, let's say a tiger, is about 100 milliseconds. So the time it takes our brain to interpret an image and recognize basic objects in them is about 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, right? And that's just about the time it takes for the nerve signal to propagate from the retina, where images are formed in the eye, to what's called a LGN, lateral geniculate nucleus, which is a small piece of brain that basically does contrast enhancement and gain control and things like that. And then that signal goes to the back of your brain, V1. That's the primary visual cortex area in humans. And then V2, which is very close to V1, there's a fold that sort of makes V1 sort of right in front of V2, and there is lots of wires between them. And then V4, and then the infratemporal cortex, which is sort of on the side here. And that's where object categories are represented. So there are neurons in the infratemporal cortex that represent, generic object categories. And, people have done experiments with this where, epileptic patients are in hospital and have their skull open because we need to locate the exact position of the source of their epilepsy seizures. And because they have electrodes at the surface of their brain, you can show them movies and then observe if a particular neuron turns on for particular movies, and you show them a movie with Jennifer Aniston, and there is this neuron that only turns on when Jennifer Aniston is there. Okay, it doesn't turn on for anything else, as far as we could tell. Okay, so you seem to have very selective neurons in the infratemporal cortex that react to a small number of categories. There's a joke, kind of a running joke in neuroscience of a concept called the grandmother cell. So this is the one neuron in your infratemporal cortex that turns on when you see your grandmother, regardless of what position, what she's wearing, how far, whether it's a photo or not. Nobody really believes in this concept. What people believe in are distributed representation. So there is no such thing as a cell that just turns on for your grandmother. There are this collection of cells that turn on for various things, and they serve to represent, general categories. But the important thing is that they are invariant to position, size, illumination, all kinds of different things. And the real motivation behind convolutional nets is to build neural nets that are invariant to irrelevant transformation of the inputs. Okay, you can still recognize a C, a D, or your grandmother, regardless of the position, and to some extent the orientation, the style, etc. So this idea that the signal only takes 100 milliseconds to go from the retina to the infratemporal cortex seems to suggest that if you count like the delay to go through every neuron or every stage in that pathway, there's barely enough time for a few spikes to get through. So there's no time for complex recurrent connection, recurrent computation. It's basically a feed-forward process. It's very fast. Okay, and we need it to be fast because that's a question of survival for us. There's a lot of, for most animals, you need to be able to recognize really quickly what's going on, particularly, fast-moving predators. Or prey, for that matter. So that kind of suggests the idea that we can do, perhaps we could come up with some sort of neural net architecture that is completely feed-forward and still can do recognition. The diagram on the right is from Gallant and Van Essen. So this is a type of sort of abstract conceptual diagram of the two pathways in the visual cortex. There is the ventral pathway and the dorsal pathway. The ventral pathway is, basically the V1, V2, V4 IT hierarchy, which is sort of from the back of the brain and goes sort of to the bottom and to the side. And then the dorsal pathway kind of goes, through the top, also towards the infratemporal cortex. And there is this idea somehow that the ventral pathway is there to tell you what you're looking at, whereas the dorsal pathway basically identifies locations, geometry, and motion. Okay? So there is a pathway for what and another pathway for where, if you want. And that seems fairly separate in the human or primate visual cortex. And of course, there are interactions between them. So various people had the idea of kind of using, so where does that idea come from? There is classic work in neuroscience from the late 50s, early 60s by Huber and Wiesel. They're on the picture here. They won the Nobel Prize for it, so it's really classic work. And what they showed with cats, basically by poking electrodes into cat brains, is that neurons in the cat brain in V1 detect are only sensitive to a small area of the visual field, and they detect oriented edges, contours, if you want, in that particular area. Okay? So the area to which a particular neuron is sensitive is called a receptive field. And you take a particular neuron and you show it kind of an oriented bar, if you want, that you rotate. And at one point, the neuron will fire, and for a particular angle, and as you move away from that angle, the activation of the neuron kind of diminishes. Okay, so that's called orientation selective neurons. And Huber and Wiesel call those simple cells. If you move the bar a little bit, you go out of the receptive field, that neuron doesn't fire anymore, doesn't react to it, there's going to be another neuron almost exactly identical to it, just a little bit, away from the first one. That does exactly the same function. It will react to a slightly different receptive field, but with the same orientation. So you start getting this idea that you have local feature detectors that are positioned, replicated all over the visual field, which is basically this idea of convolution. Okay? So those are called simple cells. And then another idea that, or discovery that Huber and Wiesel did is the idea of complex cell. So what a complex cell is another type of neuron that integrates the output of multiple simple cells within a certain area. Okay, so they will take different simple cells that all detect contours at a particular orientation, edges at a particular orientation, and compute, an aggregate of those activations. They will either do a max or a sum or a sum of square or square root of sum of square, some sort of function that does not depend on the order of the arguments. Okay? Let's say max for the sake of simplicity. So basically, a complex cell will turn on if any of the simple cells within its input group turns on. Okay, so that complex cell will detect an edge at a particular orientation regardless of its position within that little region. So it builds a little bit of shift invariance of the representation coming out of the complex cells with respect to small variation of positions of features in the input. So a gentleman by the name of Kunihiko Fukushima, no real relationship with a nuclear power plant, in the late 70s, early 80s, experimented with computer models that sort of implemented this idea of simple cell, complex cell. And he had the idea of sort of replicating this with multiple layers. So basically, the exercise he did was very similar to the one I showed earlier here with this sort of handcrafted feature detector. Some of those feature detectors in his model were handcrafted, but some of them were learned. They were learned by an unsupervised method. He didn't have backprop, right? Backprop didn't exist, so it existed, but it wasn't really popular, and people, didn't use it. So, he trained those filters basically with something that amounts to a sort of clustering algorithm, a little bit, and separately for each layer. And so he would train the filters for the first layer, train this with handwritten digits. He also had a data set of handwritten digits. And then feed this to complex cells that would kind of, pool the activity of simple cells together. And then that would form the input to the next layer, and it would repeat the same learning algorithm. His model of neuron was very complicated. It was kind of inspired by biology, so he had separate inhibitory neurons. The other neurons, only have positive weights and outgoing weights, etc. But he managed to get this thing to kind of work. Okay, not very well, but it sort of worked. Then a few years later, I basically kind of got inspired by similar architectures, but trained them supervised with backprop. Okay, so that's the genesis of convolutional nets, if you want. And then independently, more or less, Max Riesenhuber in Tommy Poggio's lab at the MIT kind of rediscovered this architecture also, but also didn't use backprop for some reason. He calls this HMax. So this is sort of the early experiments I did with convolutional nets when I was finishing my postdoc in University of Toronto in 1988, so that goes back a long time. And I was trying to figure out, does this work better on a small data set? So if you have a tiny amount of data, you train a fully connected network or a linear network with just one layer, or a network with local connections but no shared weights, or compare this with what was not yet called a convolutional net, where you have shared weights and local connections, which one works best? And it turned out that in terms of generalization ability, which are the curves on the bottom left, which you see here, the top curve here is basically the baby convolutional net architecture. trained with a very simple data set of handwritten digits that were drawn with a mouse, right? We didn't have any way of collecting images, basically, at that time. And then if you have local connections without shared weights, it doesn't, it works a little worse. And then if you have fully connected networks, it works worse. And if you have a linear network, it not only works worse, but it also overfits, it overtrains. So the test error goes down after a while. And this was trained with 320 training samples, which is really, really small. Those networks had, on the order of 5,000 connections, 1,000 parameters. So this is, a billion times smaller than what we do today. A million times, I would say. And then I finished my postdoc. I went to Bell Labs, and Bell Labs had, slightly bigger computers, but what they had was a data set that came from the Postal Service. So they had zip codes from envelopes, and we built a data set out of those zip codes, and then trained a slightly bigger neural net for 3 weeks, and got really good results. So this convolutional net did not have separate convolution and pooling. It had strided convolution. So convolutions where the window is shifted by more than 1 pixel. So that's what's the result of this? The result of this is that the output map, when you do a convolution where the stride is more than 1, you get an output whose resolution is smaller than the input. And you see an example here. So here the input is 16 by 16 pixels. That's what we could afford. The kernels are 5 by 5, but they are shifted by 2 pixels every time. And so the output here is smaller because of that. Okay, and then 1 year later, this was the next generation convolutional net. This one had separate convolution and pooling. So what is the pooling operation? At that time, the pooling operation was just another neuron, except that all the weights of that neuron were equal. Okay, so a pooling unit was basically a unit that computed an average of its inputs, and then added a bias, and then passed it to a nonlinearity, which in this case was a hyperbolic tangent function. Okay, all the nonlinearities in this network were hyperbolic tangents. At the time, that's what people were doing. And the pooling operation was performed by shifting the window over which you compute the aggregate of the output of the previous layer by 2 pixels. Okay, so here you get a 32 by 32 input window. Convolve this with filters that are 5 by 5. Yeah, I should mention that a convolution kernel sometimes is also called a filter. And so what you get here are outputs that are, I guess, -4, so it's 28 by 28. Okay, and then there is pooling, which computes an average of pixels here over a 2 by 2 window, and then shifts that window by 2. So how many such windows do you have? Since the image is 28 by 28, you divide by 2, it's 14 by 14. Okay, so those images here are 14 by 14 pixels. Okay, and they're basically half the resolution as the previous window because of this stride. Okay, now it becomes interesting because what you want now is you want the next layer to detect combinations of features from the previous layer. And so the way to do this is you have different convolution filters applied to each of those feature maps. Okay? And you sum them up. You sum the results of those 4 convolutions, and you pass the result through a nonlinearity, and that gives you one feature map of the next layer. So because those filters are 5 by 5, and those images are 14 by 14, those guys are 10 by 10, okay, to not have border effects. So each of these feature maps, of which there are 16 if I'm remember correctly, uses a different set of kernels to convolve the previous layers. In fact, the connection pattern between the feature map at this layer and the feature map at the next layer is actually not full. So not every feature map is connected to every feature map. There's a particular scheme of different combinations of feature map from the previous layer combining for feature maps at the next layer. And the reason for doing this is just to save computer time. We just could not afford to connect everything to everything. It would have taken twice the time to run, or more. Nowadays, we're kind of forced, more or less, to actually have a complete connection between feature maps in a convolutional net because of the way that multiple convolutions are implemented in GPUs, which is sad. And then the next layer up, so again, those maps are 10 by 10, those feature maps are 10 by 10. And the next layer up, again, is produced by pooling and subsampling by a factor of 2. And so those are 5 by 5. Okay, and then again, there is a 5 by 5 convolution here, but of course you can't move the window 5 by 5 over a 5 by 5 image, so it looks like a full connection, but it's actually a convolution. Okay, and keep this in mind. But you basically just only one location. Okay, and those feature maps at the top here are really outputs, and so you have one spatial location because you can only place one 5 by 5 window within a 5 by 5 image. And you have 10 of those feature maps, each of which corresponds to a category. So you train the system to classify digits from 0 to 9. You have 10 categories. This is a little animation that I borrowed from Andre Carpati. He spent the time to build this nice little animation. Which is to represent sort of multiple convolutions, right? So you have 3 feature maps here on the input, and you have 6 convolution kernels and 2 feature maps on the output. So here, the first group of 3 feature maps are convolved with the 3 input of 3 kernels are convolved with the 3 input feature maps to produce the first group, the first of the 2 feature maps, the green one at the top. Okay, and the animation stops. Okay, so this is the first group of 3 kernels convolved with the 3 feature maps, and they produce the green map at the top. And then you switch to the second group of convolution kernels. You convolve with the 3 input feature maps to produce the map at the bottom. Okay, so that's an example of you have n feature map on the input, m feature map on the output, and n times m convolution kernels to get all combinations. Here's another animation, which I made a long time ago, that shows a convolutional net after it's been trained in action, trying to recognize digits. And so what's interesting to look at here is you have an input here, which is, I believe, 32 rows by 64 columns. And after doing 6 convolutions with 6 convolution kernels, passing it through a hyperbolic tangent nonlinearity after a bias, you get those 6 feature maps here, each of which kind of activates for a different type of feature. So, for example, the feature map at the top here turns on when there is some sort of horizontal edge. This guy here turns on whenever there is a vertical edge. Okay, and those convolution kernels have been learned through backprop. The thing has been just trained with backprop, not set by hand. They're set, randomly initially. So you see this notion of equivariance here. If I shift the input image, the activations on the feature maps shift, but otherwise stay unchanged. All right, that's shift equivariance. Okay, and then we go to the pooling operation. So this first feature map here corresponds to a pooled version of this first one, the second one to the second one, third one to the third one. And the pooling operation here, again, is an average, then a bias, then a sigmoid nonlinearity. And so if this map shifts by 1 pixel, this map will shift by 1/2 pixel. Okay? So you still have equivariance, but shifts are reduced by a factor of 2, essentially. Okay, and then you have the second stage, where each of those maps here is a result of doing a convolution on each or a subset of the previous maps with different kernels, summing up the result, passing the result through a sigmoid. And so you get those kind of abstract features here that are kind of a little hard to interpret visually, but it's still equivariant to shift. Okay, and then again, you do pooling and subsampling. So the pooling also has, this tried by a factor of 2. So what you get here are maps, so that those maps shift by 1/4 pixel if the input shifts by 1 pixel. Okay, so you reduce the shift, and it becomes, might become easier and easier for following layers to kind of interpret what the shape is, because you exchange spatial resolution for feature type resolution. You increase the number of feature types as you go up the layers. The spatial resolution goes down because of the pooling and subsampling, but the number of feature maps increases, and so you make the representation a little more abstract, but less sensitive to shifts and distortions. And the next layer, again, performs convolutions, but now the size of the convolution kernel is equal to the height of the image, and so what you get is a single band for this feature map. It becomes one-dimensional. And so now any vertical shift is basically eliminated, right? It's turned into some variation of activation, but it's not a shift anymore. It's some sort of simpler, hopefully, transformation of the input. In fact, you can show it's simpler. It's flatter in some ways. Okay, so that's the sort of generic convolutional net architecture. We have, this is a slightly more modern version of it, where you have some form of normalization, batch norm, group norm, whatever. A filter bank, those are the multiple convolutions. In signal processing, they're called filter banks. A pointwise nonlinearity, generally a ReLU, and then some pooling, generally max pooling, okay, in the most common implementations of convolutional nets. You could, of course, imagine other types of pooling. I talked about the average, but the more generic version is the LP norm, which is, take all the inputs to a complex cell, elevate them to some power, and then take sum them up, and then elevate that to 1 over the power. There should be a sum inside of the p root here. Another way to pool, and again, any pooling a good pooling operation is an operation that is invariant to a permutation of the inputs. It gives you the same result regardless of the order in which you put the input. Here's another example. We talked about this function before. 1 over b log sum over inputs of e to the bx. Exponential bx. Again, that's a kind of symmetric aggregation operation that you can use. So that's kind of a stage of a convolutional net, and then you can repeat that. There's sort of various ways of positioning the normalization. Some people put it after the nonlinearity, before the pooling, it depends. But it's typical. So how do you do this in PyTorch? There's a number of different ways you can do it by writing it explicitly, writing a class. So this is an example of a convolutional net class, a particular one here, where you do convolutions, ReLU, and max pooling. Okay, so the constructor here creates convolution layers which have parameters in them. And this one has what's called fully connected layers. I hate that, okay? So there is this idea somehow that the last layer of a convolutional net like this one is fully connected because every unit in this layer is connected to every unit in that layer. So that looks like a full connection. But it's actually useful to think of it as a convolution. Okay? Now, for efficiency reasons, or maybe some other bad reasons, they're called fully connected layers. And we use the class linear here. But it kind of breaks the whole idea that your network is a convolutional network. So it's much better actually to view them as convolutions. In this case, one-by-one convolutions, which is sort of a weird concept. Okay, so here we have 4 layers, 2 convolutional layers, and 2 so-called fully connected layers. And then the way so we need to create them in the constructor, and the way we use them in the forward pass is that we do a convolution of the input, and then we apply the value, and then we do max pooling, and then we run the second layer and apply the value and do max pooling again. And then we reshape the output because it's a fully connected layer, so we want to make this a vector. So that's what the xView -1 does. And then apply a value to it. And the second fully connected layer, and then apply a softmax if we want to do classification. And so this is somewhat similar to the architecture you see at the bottom. The numbers might be different in terms of feature maps and stuff, but the general architecture is pretty much what we're talking about. Yes?
What will be the filters of the convolutional layer?
Say again?
What will be the filters of the convolutional layer?
Whatever gradient descent decides. We can look at them, but if you train with a lot of examples on natural images, the kind of filters you will see at the first layer basically will end up being mostly oriented edge detectors, very much similar to what neuroscientists observe in the cortex of animals, in the visual cortex of animals.
So the filters will change when you train the model.
They will change when you train the model. That's the whole point. Yes. Okay, so it's pretty simple. Here's another way of defining those. This is, I guess it's kind of a outdated way of doing it, right? Not many people do this anymore. But it's kind of a simple way also. There is this class in PyTorch called NN sequential, and it's basically a container, and you keep putting modules in it, and it just, automatically kind of use them as being kind of connected in sequence, right? And so then you just have to call, forward on it, and it will just compute the right thing. In this particular form here, you pass it kind of a bunch of pairs. It's like a dictionary, so you can give a name to each of the layers, and you can later kind of access them. It's the same architecture we were talking about earlier.
Forward and back propagation on a sequential direction?
Yeah. I mean, the backprop is automatic, right? You get it by default. You just call backward, and it knows how to backpropagate to it.
The reason that you create the class for your model is so that you can have maybe like more complex architecture than just like
Well, the class kind of encapsulates everything into an object, where the parameters are. There's a particular way of sort of, getting the parameters out and kind of feeding them to an optimizer. And so the optimizer doesn't need to know what your network looks like. It just knows that there is a function and there is a bunch of parameters, and it gets a gradient, and it doesn't need to know what your network looks like.
This one tomorrow, anyway.
Yeah, you'll hear more about this tomorrow. Okay, so here's a really interesting aspect of convolutional nets, and it's one of the reasons why they've become so successful in many applications. It's the fact that if you view every layer in a convolutional net as a convolution, so there is no full connection, so to speak, you don't need to have a fixed size input. You can vary the size of the input, and the network will vary its size accordingly. Because when you apply a convolution to an image, you feed it an image of a certain size, you do a convolution with a kernel, you get an image whose size is related to the size of the input, but you can change the size of the input and it just changes the size of the output. And this is true for every convolution, every convolutional-like operation, right? So if your network is composed only of convolutions, then it doesn't matter what the size of the input is. It's going to go through the network, and the size of every layer will change according to the size of the input, and the size of the output will also change accordingly. So here is a little example here where I want to do cursive handwriting recognition, and it's very hard because I don't know where the letters are, so I can't just have a character recognizer that a system that will first cut the word into letters, because I don't know where the letters are, and then apply the convolutional net to each of the letters. So the best I can do is take the convolutional net and swipe it over the input, and then record the output. Okay? And so you would think that to do this, you would have to take a convolutional net like this that has a window large enough to see a single character. Okay? And then you take your input image and you compute your neural net, your convolutional net at every location, shifting it by 1 pixel or 2 pixels or 4 pixels or something like this. A small enough number of pixels that regardless of where the character occurs in the input, you will still get a score on the output whenever it needs to recognize one. But it turns out that would be extremely wasteful because you will be redoing the same computation multiple times. And so the proper way to do this, and this is very important to understand, is that you don't do what I just described, where you have a small convolutional net that you apply to every window. What you do is you take a large input and you apply the convolutions to the input image. Since it's larger, you're going to get a larger output. You apply the second layer convolution to that, or the pooling, whatever it is. You're going to get a larger input again, etc., all the way to the top. And whereas in the original design you were getting only one output, now you're going to get multiple outputs because, it's a convolutional layer. This is super important because this way of applying a convolutional net with a sliding window is much, much, much cheaper than recomputing the convolutional net at every location. Okay? You would not believe how many decades it took to convince people that this was a good thing. So here's an example of how you can use this. This is a convolutional net that was trained on individual digits, 32 by 32. It was trained on NNIST, okay? 32 by 32 input windows. It's LoNet 5, so it's very similar to the architecture I just showed the code for, okay? It's trained on individual characters to just classify the character in the center of the image. And the way it was trained is that there was a little bit of data augmentation where the character in the center was kind of shifted a little bit in various locations, changed in size. And then there were two other characters, that was kind of added to the side to confuse it, okay, in many samples. And then it was also trained with a 11th category, which was none of the above. And the way it's trained is either you show it a blank image, or you show it an image where there is no character in the center, but there are characters on the side, okay? So that it would detect whenever it's in between two characters. And then you do this thing of, computing the convolutional net at every location on the input without actually shifting the convolutional net, but just applying the convolutions to the entire image. And that's what you get. So here, the input image is 64 by 32, even though the network was trained on 32 by 32 with those kind of generated examples. And what you see is the activity of some of the layers here. Not all of them are represented. And what you see at the top here are those kind of funny shapes. You see 3s and 5s popping up. And they basically are an indication of the winning category for every location, right? So the 8 outputs that you see at the top are basically the output corresponding to 8 different positions of the 32 by 32 input window on the input, shifted by 4 pixels every time. And what is represented is the winning category within that window, and the grayscale indicates the score, okay? So what you see is, there's 2 detectors detecting the 5 until the 3 kind of starts overlapping, and then 2 detectors detecting the 3 that kind of move around, because, within a 32 by 32 window, a 3 appears to the left of that 32 by 32 window, and then to the right of that other 32 by 32 window shifted by 4. And so those 2 detectors detect that 3 or that 5. So then what you do is you take all those scores here at the top and you do a little bit of post-processing, very simple, and you figure out it's a 3 and a 5. And what's interesting about this is that you don't need to do prior segmentation. So something that people had to do before in computer vision was, if you wanted to recognize an object, you had to separate the object from its background, because the recognition system, would get confused by the background. But here, with this convolutional net, it's been trained with overlapping characters, and it knows how to tell them apart, and so it's not confused by characters that overlap. I have a whole bunch of those on my website, by the way, those animations from the early 90s.
Was it easy to find out what's the background and what has to become classified?
What do you mean?
Like, you said that earlier they used to separate the digits from the background. So
Yeah.
does that mean it's easy for, like, suppose you have a stop sign. Earlier, was it an easy task to crop out the stop sign for the rest of the picture?
No, that was the main issue. That's one of the reasons why computer vision wasn't working very well. It's because the very problem of figure ground separation, detecting an object and recognizing it is the same. You can't recognize the object until you segment it, but you can segment it until you recognize it. It's the same for cursive handwriting recognition, right? You can't, so here's an example. Do we have pens? It doesn't look like we have pens, right? Oh, here we go. That's true. I'm sorry. Maybe I should use if this works. Oh, of course. Okay. Can you guys read this? Okay. I mean, it's horrible handwriting, but it's also because, I'm writing on the screen. Okay, now can you read it? Minimum, yeah. Okay, there's absolutely no way you can segment the letters out of this, right? I mean, it's kind of a random number of waves. But just the fact that the 2 eyes are identified, then it's basically non-ambiguous, at least in English. So that's a good example of, the interpretation of individual objects, depending on their context. And what you need is some sort of high-level language model to know what words are possible. If you don't know English or similar languages that have the same word, there's no way you can read this. Spoken language is very similar to this. So all of you who have had the experience of learning a foreign language probably have the experience that you have a hard time segmenting words from a new language and then recognizing the words because you don't have the vocabulary. Right? So if I speak in French, si je commence à parler français, vous n'avez aucune idée où sont la limite des mots, except if you speak French. So I spoke a sentence, it's words, but you can't tell the boundary between the words, right? Because there is basically no clear seizure between the words, unless you know what the words are in advance, right? So that's the problem of segmentation. You can't recognize until you segment, you can't segment until you recognize, you have to do both at the same time. And, early computer vision systems had a really, really hard time doing this. So that's why, this kind of stuff is big progress, because you don't have to do segmentation in advance. It just, just train your system to be robust to kind of overlapping objects and things like that. Yes, in the back.
Is there a background class added to this model?
Yes, there is a background class. So when you see a blank response, it means the system says none of the above, basically, right? So it's been trained to produce none of the above, either when the input is blank or when there is one character that's too, outside of the center, or when you have two characters but there's nothing in the center, or when you have two characters that overlap but there is no central character, right? So it's, trained to detect boundaries between characters, essentially. Here's another example. So this is an example that shows that even a very simple convolutional net with just two stages, right? Convolution pooling, and then two layers of, two more layers afterwards, can solve what's called the feature binding problem. So visual neuroscientists and computer vision people had the issue, it was kind of a puzzle. How is it that we perceive objects as objects? Objects are collections of features, but how do we bind all the features together of an object to form this object? Is there some kind of magical way of doing this? And they did, psychologists did experiments like, draw this and then that. And you perceive the bar as a single bar because you're used to bars being, occluded by other objects. And so you just assume it's an occlusion. And then there were experiments that, figure out like how much do I have to shift the two bars to kind of make me perceive them as two separate bars. But in fact, they may not be perfectly aligned. And if you do this, they may be exactly identical to what you see here, but now you perceive them as two different objects. So, how is it that we seem to be solving the feature binding problem? And what this shows is that you don't need any specific mechanism for it, it just happens. If you have enough nonlinearities and you train with enough data, then as a side effect, you get the system that solves the feature binding problem without any particular mechanism for it. So here you have two shapes and you move a single stroke and it goes from a 6 and a 1 to a 3 to a 5 and a 1 to a 7 and a 3, etc.
How do you distinguish between when you have two pipes, one after each other, and instead of a multiple detection of the same?
Right. Good question. So the question is, how do you distinguish between the two situations where you have two 5s next to each other and the fact that you have a single 5 being detected by two different frames, right? Two different framing of that 5. Well, there is this explicit training so that when you have two characters that are touching and none of them is really centered, you train the system to say none of the above, right? So it's always going to have 5 blank 5. It's always going to have even like 1 blank 1, and the ones can be very close. It will tell you the difference. Okay, so what are conv nets good for?
Professor,
Yes.
I had a doubt in the last slide. When training the network to predict a sequence of digits, how was the output layer taken care of? Like, were the number of neurons in the output changed? Or how was the output layer able to cater to the large number of feature maps that were produced by the increased feature size?
Okay, so what you have to look at is this. So every layer here is a convolution, okay, including the last layer. So it looks like a full connection because every unit in the second last layer goes into the output. But in fact, it is a convolution. It just happens to be applied to a single location. So now imagine that this layer at the top here now is bigger, okay, which is represented here, okay? Now the size of the kernel is the size of the image you had here previously, but now it's a convolution that has multiple locations, right? And so what you get is multiple outputs.
So we have multiple copies of the output layer.
That's right. That's right. Each of which corresponds to, you know, a classification over an input window of size 32 by 32 in the example I showed. And those windows are shifted by 4 pixels. The reason being that the network architecture I showed here has convolution with stride 1, then pooling with stride 2, convolution with stride 1, pooling with stride 2. And so the overall stride is 4, right? And so to get a new output, you need to shift the input window by 4 to get one of those because of the 2 pooling layers with. And maybe I should be a little more explicit about this. Let me draw a picture that would be clearer. So you have an input. Like this. You do a convolution, let's say, a convolution of size 3. Okay, here, stride 1. Okay, I'm not going to draw all of them. Then you have pooling with subsampling of size 2. So you pool over 2, and the stride is 2, so you shift by 2. No overlap. Okay, so here the input is this size, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Because the convolution is of size 3, you get an output here of size 6. And then when you do pooling with subsampling with stride 2, you get 3 outputs because that divides the output by 2. Okay. Let me add another one. Actually 2. Okay, so now the output is 10. This guy is 8. This guy is 4. I can do convolutions now also. Let's say 3. I only get 2 outputs. Okay. Oops. Not sure why it doesn't draw. Doesn't want to draw anymore. That's interesting. Aha. It doesn't react to clicks. That's interesting. Okay. I'm not sure what's going on. Oh, Sean is not responding. All right. I guess it crashed on me. Well, that's annoying. Yeah, it definitely crashed. And of course, you forgot it, so. Okay, so we had 10, then 8. Because of convolution with 3, then we have pooling of size 2 with stride 2, so we get 4. Then we have convolution with 3, so we get 2. Okay, and then maybe pooling again. Size 2 and subsampling 2, we get 1. Okay, so 10 input, 8, 4, 2, and then 1 for the pooling. This is convolution 3, you're right. This is 2. And those are 3, etc. Right, now let's assume I add a few units here. Okay, so that's going to add, let's say, 4 units here, 2 units here. Then yeah, this one is like this and like that. So I got 4. and I got another one here. Okay, so now I had only one output, and by adding four inputs here, which is now 14, I got 2 outputs. Why 4? Because I have 2 stride of 2. Okay, so the overall subsampling ratio from input to output is 4. It's 2 times 2. So now this is 12, and this is 6, and this is 4. So that's a demonstration of the fact that you can increase the size of the input, it will increase the size of every layer, and if you have a layer that has size 1 and it's a convolutional layer, its size is going to be increased. Yes? Change the size of the letter, like vertically, horizontally? Yeah, so there's going to be, so first you have to train for it. If you want the system to have some invariance to size, you have to train it with characters of various sizes. You can do this with data augmentation if your characters are normalized. That's the first thing. Second thing is, empirically, simple convolutional nets are only invariant to size to within a factor of relatively small factor. Like you can increase the size by, maybe 40% or something. I mean, change the size by 40%, plus minus 20% or something like that, right? Beyond that, you might have kind of more trouble getting invariance. But people have trained with objects of sizes that vary by a lot. So the way to handle this is, if you want to handle variable size, is that if you have an image and you don't know what size the objects are that are in this image, you apply your convolutional net to that image, and then you take the same image, reduce it by a factor of 2, just scale the image by a factor of 2, run the same convolutional net on that new image, and then reduce it by a factor of 2 again and run the same convolutional net again on that image. Okay? So the first convolutional net will be able to detect small objects within the image. So let's say your network has been trained to detect objects of size, 20 pixels, like faces, for example, right? There are 20 pixels. It will detect faces that are roughly 20 pixels within this image. And then when you subsample by a factor of 2 and you apply the same network, it will detect faces that are 20 pixels within the new image, which means there were 40 pixels in the original image, okay? Which the first network will not see because, the face would be bigger than its input window. And then the next network over will detect faces that are 80 pixels, etc., right? So then by kind of combining the scores from all of those and doing something called non-maximum suppression, you can actually do detection and localization of objects. People use considerably more sophisticated techniques for detection now and for localization that we'll talk about next week. But that's the basic idea. So let me conclude. What are conv nets good for? They're good for signals that come to you in the form of a multidimensional array. But that multidimensional array has to have 2 characteristics at least. The first one is there is strong local correlations between values. So if you take an image, random image, take 2 pixels within this image, 2 pixels that are nearby. Those 2 pixels are very likely to have very similar colors. Okay? Take a picture of this class, for example, 2 pixels on the wall basically have the same color. Okay, it looks like there is a ton of object here, but animate objects. But in fact, mostly statistically, neighboring pixels are essentially the same color. As you move the distance from 2 pixels away and you compute the statistics of how similar pixels are as a function of distance, they're less and less similar. So what does that mean is because nearby pixels are likely to have similar colors, that means that when you take a patch of pixels, say 5 by 5 or 8 by 8 or something, the type of patch you're going to observe is very likely to be kind of a smoothly varying color, or maybe with an edge. But among all the possible combinations of 25 pixels, the ones that you actually observe in natural images is a tiny subset. What that means is that it's advantageous to represent the content of that patch by a vector with perhaps less than 25 values that represent the content of that patch. Is there an edge? Is it uniform? What color is it? Things like that, right? And that's basically what the convolutions in the first layer of a convolutional net are doing. Okay, so if you have local correlations, there is an advantage in detecting local features. That's what we observe in the brain. That's what convolutional nets are doing. It's the idea of locality. If you feed a convolutional net with permuted pixels, it's not going to be able to do a good job at recognizing your images, even if the permutation is fixed.
We see that tomorrow.
Right. A fully connected net doesn't care about permutations. Then the second characteristic is that features that are important may appear anywhere on the image. So that's what justifies shared weights. Okay, the local correlation justifies local connections. The fact that features can appear anywhere, that the statistics of images or the signal is uniform, means that you need to have repeated feature detectors for every location. And that's where shared weights come into play.
It also justifies the pooling as well.
It does justify the pooling because the pooling is if you want invariance to variations in the location of those characteristic features. And so if the objects you're trying to recognize don't change their nature by kind of being slightly distorted, then you want pooling. So people have used convnets for all kinds of stuff, image, video, text, speech. So speech actually is speech recognition convnets are used a lot. Time series prediction, things like that. And, biomedical image analysis. So if you want to, analyze an MRI, for example, MRI or a CT scan is a 3D image. As humans, we can't, because we don't have the good visualization technology, we can't really apprehend, understand a kind of a 3D volume, a 3D dimensional image. But a convnet is fine. Feed it a 3D image and it will deal with it. That's a big advantage because you don't have to go through slices to kind of figure out the object in the image. And then the last thing here at the bottom, I don't know if you guys know what hyperspectral images are. So a hyperspectral image is an image where, most natural color images, images that you collect with a normal camera, you get 3 color components, RGB. But we can build cameras with way more spectral bands than this. And that's particularly the case for satellite imaging where some cameras have many spectral bands going from infrared to ultraviolet. And that gives you a lot of information about what you're seeing in each pixel. Some tiny animals that have small brains find it easier to process hyperspectral images of low resolution than high resolution images with just 3 colors. For example, this particular type of shrimp, right? They have those beautiful eyes and they have like 17 spectral bands or something, but super low resolution and they have a tiny brain to process it. Okay, that's all for today. See you